Hey everybody, it's Andy, and welcome again to my office in Modesto, California. I'm an attorney licensed to practice law in California as well as New York, and in this video I'm going to talk to you guys about the use of pre-printed legal documents. Now I'm going to talk based on my California experience, of course, but if you live elsewhere in the United States, pre-printed legal forms definitely exist for you also. They're definitely not California unique or California specific. Come to think of it, I actually don't know if pre-printed legal forms are an international phenomenon also. So if you live in another country, I have no idea. It might just be a unique thing that is kind of specific to the US. If you actually live in another country, and especially if you're an attorney in another country actually, leave me a comment down below and tell me whether or not pre-printed legal forms are used in your country, whether or not they're illegal perhaps, whether or not they're commonly used, whether or not they're overused. Let me know all that stuff. I'm always interested in learning how law in other countries is done. So all of that stuff said then, let me go ahead and try and define what a pre-printed legal form is. I think of them in terms of two categories. So the first one is what I think all of us would call the fill-in-the-blanks type form. These, I want to say, have been around since like the 1960s or something. And it's basically a document that, for instance, if it's a contract, the contract is 80% written. So the 80% that's actually typed in for you is, common language, like every contract has it. So the remaining 20% then is going to be language that changes from contract to contract. So the names of the parties, the dates, addresses, that kind of thing. So that's the first category. The second category, I think, is it's basically an internet-driven sort of phenomenon. So people will oftentimes post legal documents online. So, for example, they might put out a sample contract. They'll put out a lease that they use, for example, the sharing sort of attitude online. People will tend to share documents like that. So Google, being Google, will eventually find PDFs and Word documents and things that are posted like that. So if somebody is searching for an apartment lease, for example, by just typing the words sample apartment lease or example apartment lease or something like that into Google a lot of times will just find these PDFs of apartment leases that people have shared. If you're trying to search for an example or an exemplar that way, that by itself is actually not bad. I know a lot of lawyers who actually do that. I've done it myself on several occasions where, for instance, I'm trying to draft a particular document that I've never drafted before. And it's really helpful for me if I see a sample of, oh, hey, yeah, this is the type of stuff that this document talks about. This is the formatting of this document and so forth. So to have a visual kind of guide, I guess, is really helpful. Lawyers do that all the time. The problem, I think, is the problem, basically. I'm trying to find a better word than problem, but problem is all I can think of. The problem that arises when you search for documents this way online, however, is that there is a very common, unfortunately it's very common, tendency for people to take documents that they find online, to take samples that they find online, and just use it verbatim for their situation. They cut and paste, etc., and they basically take a contract that they find online somewhere and use it for their situation, or they take a lease that they find online, somewhere and use it for their situation. If you understand the document that you're using, like if you understand the lease provisions that you're copying over, if you understand the terms of the contract that you're copying over and so on, doing that is perfectly fine. If you understand, for instance, what those contract terms do, don't do, and so forth. The problem arises when people who don't understand the contract terms that they're copying, who don't understand the lease terms that they're copying, they do it anyway. Like they take terms that they don't understand, put it into a legal document, sign it, and agree to be bound by that document. I would have thought, I guess, that common sense, which now that I say it, admittedly, is not that common, I would have thought that common sense would have told everyone, don't use a document that you don't understand. Certainly don't sign a document that you don't understand. I think, well, hopefully common sense should tell you that if you don't understand a document, you could get sued. You could violate the document, breach the contract, let's say, unintentionally. A whole bunch of bad things can happen if you don't understand what you're signing. Even so, I see a lot of times, or a lot of people rather, who have signed or used documents that they don't understand. A common kind of excuse, I guess, is, well, Andy, it looked fine. I found it online somewhere. So if you are going to use a document, or if you're trying to find a document online that is that you want to use for your situation, the process that I would go through, I guess, this is just kind of me thinking off the top of my head right now. There's basically a 3-part process, I guess, that I would go through. The first is that, for the situation that you're trying to deal with, even before you search for a document, like, you need to figure out for yourself, decide for yourself what you want or what you desire out of the situation. So let's say, for instance, that you're a landlord and you're renting out an apartment. In your mind, you should have, you should know what rent you want, what term on the lease you want, whether or not you want, the tenant to have pets or allow them to have pets, and so forth. So you need to decide what it is that you want before you go look for a document, I think. Once you go look for a document and you find one, you need to look to see whether or not that document accurately reflects what it is that you want. So let's say that you're a landlord and you're trying to rent out an apartment, and you decide that you don't want your tenants to have pets, like you just don't want the hassle of it. So if you find a lease online that you really like, you need to check whether or not that lease says pets are not allowed. Because if you don't want your tenants to have pets, but you have them sign a lease that says that the tenants can have pets, clearly that's going to cause a problem later on, right? So the third part, which I guess, depending on how you count, it could be the second part too, but the third thing that I would recommend people consider is, if you are trying to determine whether or not a document is suitable for your situation, you need to, like I said, see if the document reflects what it is that you want, but you also need to see whether or not the document adequately, you need to see whether or not the document adequately protects you from the risks and dangers that are present. So, can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but based on the particulars of the situation, if you are, if there's a risk that you're facing, generally you want to have the contract, do away with that risk or minimize it, as a means of protection for yourself. Maybe that involves buying insurance, maybe that involves, shifting the risk onto someone else, etc. So you need to make sure that the document, I said accurately again, the document adequately is what I mean. The document adequately protects you against the risks and dangers that are present. So those, I think, are not going to be, I don't mean those 3 things to be an exhaustive list, but if I was trying to find a sample document online to kind of assemble my own, assuming I didn't write one completely from scratch, that's kind of the thought process that I would go through. Number 1, decide what I want. Number 2, determine whether or not the document that I found accurately reflects what I want. And number 3, determine whether or not the document adequately protects me from the risks that I can kind of foresee in the situation. That's where I would start, I guess. I would definitely not, download a document, just randomly search for a document and copy and paste it and use it without understanding it. I would definitely not do that. That's just inviting problems of all different kinds. So, hopefully all of this sort of made sense, I guess. To kind of summarize for all of you, if you want to use a pre-printed document, that's definitely not a bad thing. You just have to realize what the limitations of the pre-printed form are. So, if you're using a pre-printed document from a book, let's say, that you found at the local library, you can certainly do that. Just kind of realize that, because those pre-printed forms are generic, they will apply to most situations, but not really apply to any situation perfectly. Unless it's really cost prohibitive, for example, when it comes to legal documents, you generally want your legal document to suit you perfectly. You definitely do not want to, search for a document online, just pick any random document, just use that. Like, you need to understand what the document says, and the limitations and so forth. So I'm going to leave you guys with an analogy, perhaps. Let me know in the comments below whether or not this analogy is helpful. So what I said a moment ago about a generic document, fitting sort of okay, I guess, for most situations, but not perfectly in any situation. Think of it in terms of like buying clothing. So if you go shopping for, say, a tuxedo or a dress or some article of clothing that you have to get the size correct. If you're shopping for a tuxedo, let's say, and you go to a department store and you can probably find a tuxedo that will fit you, assuming that you're not like, your body shape is not unusual, like you're super tall, super overweight, etc. Most people can go to a department store and find a suit jacket or a tuxedo or some type of clothing that will fit them okay, but it's not tailored. If you want a really good fit, if you want your tuxedo to fit perfectly, for example, to look really good, you need to go and get ideally, if you can afford it, go and get your tuxedo, handmade from scratch. If you can afford it, great. Most people can't do that. I would recommend, or I would kind of, submit that there's a kind of a middle ground here. So on one extreme is you buy off the rack. On the other extreme is you actually have it tailored completely from scratch. In the middle, perhaps, there is an alternative or an option where you can buy something off the rack and then have it tailored in some small, minor way to suit you perfectly. If you do that, I've never done that, but like if you do that, I would imagine that the off the rack item that you bought will maybe not look as good as a handmade version, but it will look much better. Like people will hopefully notice it. And you'll be much happier with a piece of clothing that actually fits you really well. So I guess if you kind of analogize that to pre-printed documents, let's say, it might be that, okay, well, if you have a template document that you found online, or a template or generic document you found in a book, you can use that as a starting point, but you need to tailor it for your particular situation. So for instance, if you found a generic will online, you can use that as a starting point. You probably will use 70% of it, maybe 80% of it. The remaining 20%, however, you should take that and tailor the will, add some stuff, remove some stuff, etc. Tailor the will to fit your particular situation. You can use the generic version as a starting point, but you need to add stuff, take away stuff to kind of make it suit your particular needs. So that's hopefully going to be easier, cheaper than writing a will, for instance, from scratch. But it's going to be much better in terms of the document doing what it is that you actually want. So anyway, the tailored clothing example, hopefully that makes sense to a lot of you. But anyway, leave me a comment down below. Like I said, if you are in another country and whether or not pre-printed legal forms exist for you. Leave me a comment below whether or not the tailored clothing analogy actually was helpful or not. But so otherwise, go ahead and comment, generally, I guess, and share, like, subscribe, etc. And I will talk to you guys next time. Thanks.